Good morning. It's lecture number 3 in Anthropology and the Human Condition today. And we're going to talk about French Surrealism, French anthropology, some people like George Bataille and his great book, The Sacred Conspiracy, and the Acéphale. Acéphale means without a head. And then these are really fat books. Michel Lery's Phantom Africa. And Michel Lery, very interesting fellow, photograph of him in his tent, which, you know, is the continuity with last week with Malinowski. Photographed in his tent on the mission Dhaka, Djibouti. I also want to talk about Michael Taussig, a recent book of his called The Mastery of Non-Mastery in the Age of Meltdown. Are we in the age of meltdown? Maybe we are. And an earlier book of his, The Color of the Sacred, which is a lot of fun. I even get a nod in this. My old friend, Professor of the Big Heart, John Hutnick of Goldsmiths College. Those were the days. And I also want to mention other work that's really current. So we're not just talking about really old stuff. I visited to Tombouctou last year, or year before actually now, Stephen Muki, whose book Joe in the Andamans was fictocritical. And fictocriticism is a style of work that we should discuss. So let me move into my slides. So I haven't pictured everyone, of course, but what we got here, not in the correct order. The guy in the green shirt is Michael Taussig, Australian-born, Sydney-sider, but has long, like forever, lived in New York, teaches at Columbia University in the anthropology department. He's the 1933 professor of anthropology. That's like an honorary title for his chair, a named chair, they call it, which has some prestige. The next guy sitting there in the library, that's George Bataille. Very important that he's in a library. He was a librarian as well as an anthropologist and a pornographer. And the one standing up in the tux is Michel Lery, whose writing is, well, beautiful. It's Taussig I'm going to start with because I wanted to get contemporary as quick as we could since we've been doing history. But we are still doing history of, you know, the precursors to contemporary anthropology. Why? Because you need to know where ideas come from, I guess, and so many of them in anthropology are generated from this period in the 1920s and 1930s, and we pore over them and regenerate new things from this material. I guess Taussig is more influenced by someone you'll find that I talk about in other courses more, Walter Benjamin, but we'll get to him at the end a little bit. But certainly also by Bataille. Although his first book, Taussig's first book was called The Devil and Commodity Fetishism, back in 1980, so it's 40 years ago now. He did his fieldwork in the country of Colombia among worker communities in the mines and sugar plantations of the Pacific Delta, I suppose, of Colombia. And his first volume, I keep on getting new copies of it and lending it and not getting it back. It's so good. Is amazing because it's a kind of study, as the title suggests, The Devil and Commodity Fetishism. It's a Marxist study, right? But it does something completely new and different, recognizes that money has this fetish autonomy, right? That relations between humans get projected into relations between things, and one of those things is the thing of money, and money is amongst these communities is kind of anthropomorphized, made to seem like a human actor, although not a human actor, more so it becomes the devil. Money takes the form of the devil, and varieties of this idea. You make a contract with the devil, and getting money is a sign that you've made this contract with the devil, and it's recognized and kind of accepted. You have to do this if you want to do well, but it's a mystification. This was the cover of his book, and without that book, without Michael Taussig's work, a lot of anthropologists wouldn't have found their way back to Georges Bataille and Michel Leary, even though their work is intensely relevant to economic questions. And they, especially Bataille, provides one of the really important and stunningly original reinterpretations of Marx's economic within the Marxist tradition, but not like certainly not accepted by many in the communist tradition, but certainly by some, and I would argue belongs to that tradition, but is also claimed by many others. In fact, I spent a lot of time 20 years ago writing on ways to kind of recognize and reclaim Georges Bataille to the communist tradition rather than the art world which he'd been consigned. And Michael Taussig's reading of Bataille is sort of in between those two. So that made it possible for me to then go back and carefully read all of Bataille's early work, see that he was involved in all sorts of anti-racist, anti-fascist, and similar political struggles, and find his, and then it was published by his own in translation, find his texts on economic anthropology, which are stunningly brilliant, and we'll get to them. Taussig's work, Commodity Fetishism, really was an operationalization of Marx's concepts of commodity and money into anthropology. And that was something similar to what Bataille had done, but it was inspired. It was really interesting. Bataille is his reference for much of this text, the idea of mystical economy, but beginning with things that were standard for anthropology at the time, and which have roots in Malinowski's Cooler as well, the idea of the gift and exchange, and Bataille's prestation, giving of gifts, and using gifts to show that you're a big figure, right? So there's a big connection with last week's discussion of Malinowski. But the exchanges that Bataille takes on board, he takes them into the realms of not just exchange between humans, but exchange between energies, I suppose. I mean, at one point, he's talking about the energy that belongs to a tiger, that a tiger in space is like the sexual act in time. It's like an overabundance of exuberant. A tiger has too much energy for that space. Like that's why a tiger leaps, a tiger roars, a tiger has so much muscle and energy, well beyond what a tiger needs. Well, except for in that couple of seconds when it chases an antelope or something. Or he talks about the sun and exchange with the earth. The sun endlessly gives energy. The solar economy. Like so at one level it's talking about economics, but at another level it's completely crazy or imaginative, anyway, surreal. And you know, and then there's also an economy in the obscene and the underworld, and that's where the devil and commodity fetishism really finds its meta, its interest, in that this economy of exchange between the living and the dead, between the devil and the underworld and the unconscious. Taussig's next book was a critique of anthropology of some sort, partly because anthropologists reacted to his first book, I think, with like mixed emotions. Some recognized its brilliance, some thought, what is this? His next book was called Shamanism, Colonialism, and the Wild Man, a study in terror and healing. The shaman is an indigenous healer, right? And there were cases where colonists were interested in what shamans were doing and their herbal knowledge and so on, and appropriated that. But there are other senses in which they completely excluded the thinking of shamans as superstition or magical thinking, and so not acceptable to science. So they characterized that as wildness. The shaman is the tribal healer, right? Or maybe it doesn't have to be a male, might be like the equivalent of a midwife in the early modernity, the late Middle Ages or something. Someone who knew the human frailties and knew different techniques, whether herbal or other philosophical practices handed down over generations or discovered or what have you, for providing for the health of the community. And sometimes there was holistic medicine in that style, where we talk about it now, and sometimes it was potions and herbs, and sometimes it was a kind of psychology through collective or chanting or management. Anyway, much of interest. But there was this double play in the book in the context of colonialism. The colonists were terrorized, I suppose, by the knowledge of the colonized. And there was, on the one hand, they're shamans, on the other hand, they're wild men. And this was negotiation, I suppose, of some sort in their conception. But it's Taussig's use of, I suppose, Freud's idea of fetish that came out in this as well, that the shamanism uses the fetish as a healing term. And let's get into this a little bit. Fetishism is chapter 1 of Capital. And it's much debated in anthropology and I suppose in all Marxism. If you read Marx's Capital, chapter 1 is a summary of an earlier book by Marx. And he's kind of quickly putting out his key ideas, actually in the first 3 sections, so that he can get on with his analysis. But we need to take on board those key concepts. First, that of exchange. So what's happening in the market is going to be exchange. The values of why we even go to exchange, market use value and exchange value, right? And production for use compared to production for exchange. And then how in more complex society became more often the production of things was production for exchange, so you could get to use other things, and that elevated to a market. And eventually these things seemed to take on a life of their own because they had to be exchanged through a medium, that medium became money eventually. The barter at first at the edges of communities, and then later becomes money. And then these things and money seem to take on a life of their own, and even a life that controls the people that produce these things, to the benefit of some rather than others. Right. So, and Marx is just setting out those concepts in the first part. Although too many people read that as the be-all and end-all of the story, when in fact it's just the key concepts that you need to then get on to the analysis of capitalism proper. But yeah, what Taussig takes from that is to see there are different ways in which the fetish can work, and the fetish can become the fetish of money can become a devil in the mindset of some. I mean, other things can be the fetish. In his book, great book, My Cocaine Museum, which is the one I recommend to people to read, not because it's, you know, about cocaine and that's kind of racy and interesting, but because it's really an amazing study where he makes connections between the cocaine economy, the arms economy, because these are related, the war on drugs and the selling of weapons, or the creation of a market for US weapons is related, and then the shamanistic use of substances. And it's based on his 30 years by the time this comes out, he spent 30 years going back and forth to, nearly 30 years going back and forth to Colombia. And yeah, it's kind of anecdotal in its writing, but it's really insightful and accessible. So Taussig works on many topics. Shamanism, as I've said, on mimesis, which means kind of memory, really, on imitation or memory or repetition, right? So the great book on mimesis is by Eric Auerbach, on literature and I want to say copying in literature, but more like repeat or tribute, so that some texts are knowingly channeling other texts. It's not like plagiarism or something like that. It's more like in the style of. And mimesis is also the construction of something like reality. It's like a copy of reality in the world of a book, of a novel, or something like that. And for Taussig, that metaphor is becomes social. Like the social world is something like a recognition of what the social is really like. And we, in fact, don't have real access to what the social is really like. We only have the stories that we tell about it, right? And some of them we call science, some of them we call literature, some of them we call, I don't know, mistaken assumptions and so on. But we all have stories that we tell. You know, as I mentioned, his book on color, he takes up these topics. Like for him, it's almost like in this one. Let me read from the back. Playful, enthralling, and whip-smart, his writing makes ingenious connections between ideas, thinkers, and things. An extended meditation on the mysteries of colour and the fascination they provoke. What colour is the sacred is the next step on Taussig's remarkable intellectual path. Right? What he's done, and right there in the title, is almost like the key to the way he thinks. He puts things that don't necessarily obviously belong together and thinks about them. So the devil and commodity fetishism is an example, but also the question, what color is the sacred? Like, not a question that others have asked before. Why would you even think of asking what color the sacred is? Like, what color is God? All right, maybe you could ask that, because God is not white, God is not male, God is not, you know, there are people who could talk about that. But to explore the concept of color and how color is divided and measured is a really anthropological kind of question, right? The fascination of early ethnographers with how many different words Eskimos have, or Inuit people have, for snow, right? It's because of their context. They have to distinguish all different kinds of snow, or different words for different colors. And then also, so he's using this interpretive rule of thumb to think about the different ways in which we construe the sacred. I gave as a reference for the reading a section from, and I think I gave as reference for the reading, let me just check that, a section, I thought it was a section from, I know I gave Carrie Clanton's Ethnographic Surrealism, but I sometimes give, and I will put up now next, I knew I hadn't done that, a section from his, oh no, what I suggested as preparatory reading, if you're going to read a whole book in this course, I had suggested you read Law in a Lawless Land, which was, I can put that up as a link if you don't have it. You can find it, of course, online, but I'll put it up. Law in a Lawless Land, text that he wrote after, it was a diary he wrote in Colombia during the paramilitary curfew crackdown, right? So he went back to visit the place where he's done his field work, but at this stage, the right-wing paramilitaries had taken over, and so you couldn't really go out at night or something. So he got a lot of writing done. He wrote a diary, which he then wrote up into this book, largely in my kitchen, and also thought a lot about what it is to write a diary as a way of doing anthropology or doing sociology, or doing social description, how your everyday commentary can become kind of like research notes. That's really interesting, and that was what was inspiring for Stephen Mukey and Joe and the Andamans, who basically writes a travelogue as a kind of sociological analysis. So it's a day-to-day story, like a diary, I suppose, of his trip to the Andaman Islands with his son. And the Andaman Islands are interesting because his son's really into the Phantom comics, and the Phantom has his kind of cave. The Phantom's skull cave is in the Andaman Islands, but it's also a commentary on colonialism. I mean, you'll see from the cover drawing, which is in the old Boys Adventure School thing, it's actually a picture of a colonial scene. But the book is done as if it was partly a notebook. You see in the back cover, it's kind of stitched together like a damaged book a little bit, but it's beautifully produced. It's the oldie style, but updated. Anyway, writing about diaries became a methodological precept for Taussig, as was his field notes, and then even the drawings in his field notes. So he wrote a book on drawings, although I swear I saw that, where he drew these things that were just like smashed his mind. They were like, I saw it, I drew it, I can't even believe it was really happening. Actually, it's mostly a person was being stitched into a bed inside the really polluted underpass or a road in Rio, I think it was. His mastery of non-mastery in the age of meltdown is really also a reflection on the environment, ecology, I suppose. What it is to have mastery over the world, over nature. at that level, it's really interesting. He wrote a book called The Defacement as well, which is similar to the mimesis stuff, but on largely a commentary on Walter Benjamin, his other inspiration from the Frankfurt School. So he's much less interested in Adorno. The main thing, though, he's brought to us, I guess, is he's the one who introduces us again to, as if we hadn't really forgotten, but to another kind of Georges Bataille. Georges Bataille, the anthropologist, rather than Georges Bataille, who'd been taken up by art critics and the art world as someone who commentated on art a lot, but also who was a pornographer, famous for writing the book The Story of the Eye, which is a very bizarre pornographic book. If you read that, of course I recommend that you read it, but be prepared for something strange with eggs and very strange stuff. His book Blue of Noon is much more interesting, partly about bullfighting in Spain. Bataille never really travels. He doesn't go outside of Europe, but he is really fascinated in everything. And he starts out, well, not exactly where he starts out. When he was young, he had to look after his father during World War I. His father was in Reims, the city of Reims in France. And as I said last week, the World War I was a battle between England and Germany, largely, but it was fought in France. And so Bataille, as a teenager, spent like more than a year, I think, 500 days or something, in the besieged and bombed city of Reims. Reims was bombed every day for like 500 days or so. And Georges Bataille's father could not walk, so couldn't be moved. So young George was the one who stayed back and looked after him, his father who was infirm. And no doubt this gave him a different perspective on life, right? As many surely experienced in France during the war. And some people will say that the art movements that emerged immediately after World War I were partly because of the trauma. They emerged in France, partly because the trauma reset minds to think about what was important. Right? And Georges Bataille was partly involved with Dada, but mainly involved with Surrealism at first. Surrealism, the Surrealist movement. And the reading I gave you was about Surrealist Anthropology by Carrie Clanton. So you have read that, or some of it at least, and must know a little bit about what is Surrealism. But let me go through it anyway. Well, let me mention Dada first. Dada is more like Dada, there. It's statements of life, or actually a lot of Dadaists ended up committing suicide. They thought that life didn't live up, and they removed themselves. Dada looked at events and made strange art events and shocking things just to try and in World War I, everything had closed down. People had looked at the dark, bleak side of life. So in order to like electrify and revivify life, Dada was into shocking things. And the Surrealists followed on from that immediately, especially in the hands of the amazing André Breton. Although Breton sort of tried to control what Surrealism was. Now, Surrealism, so they're interested in the real, but in the super real. What really is the real? And getting through to that. And they had different takes on that. But the thing that makes Bataille interesting is Bataille was a kind of critic from within. He was in the Surrealists, but he was kicked out, so to speak, by Bataille. But he remained its kind of enemy within. A gentle critic, or a very harsh critic, but one who always believed in the program. he writes very interestingly about Breton. He says, "I have nothing much to say about the personality of Andre Breton. His police reports don't interest me." Right? Police reports Bataille is commenting on how Breton is trying to manage what surrealism will be, and it's almost like he's an agent of the state, saying what is legal, what's not. That doesn't interest Bataille. His only regret is that he's obstructed the pavement for so long with his degrading idiocies. That's a bit harsh. Religion should die with this old religious windbag. Still, it'd be worthwhile to retain the memory of this swollen abscess of clerical phraseology, if only to discourage young people from castrating themselves in their dreams. All right, it gets a little bit harsh. He's criticizing Breton, but I think he's also enjoying the spikiness of his sentences, languages here. He's associating Breton as the priest of the new art movement, and so the priest has to keep, like the police, has to keep everything in order and everyone believing in the same gospel according to the God that is Breton, and that this is a form of cutting off other possibilities, castrating the dreams of the young. So there's also Bataille's sexual, pornographic fascination coming out in this commentary. Now, Bataille was, as I said, he wrote The Story of the Eye. He published it anonymously because, I don't know exactly why he published it anonymously. He was, though, working in the Bibliothèque Nationale. He was a librarian. He was responsible for, he was a numismatist, right? Numismatism, which is a great word. Numismatist is someone who looks after, takes care of coins, studies coins. As you know, coins are one of the things that are found that last, right? A hoard of coins collected by some businessman and buried hundreds of years ago will tell us about exchange and trade routes and so on, because you can look at what is stamped on the coins and work out where they're from. The degree to which coins are worn will suggest how far they've come from where they were originally minted. Stamps on them tell you how old, or which country authorized, or which country, or which king, or which authority authorized them, if there is one. And so that's a whole area of material culture studies that belongs in museums, of course. Notoriously, Bataille and Larry used to go out partying in Paris most nights until early in the morning, and often Bataille didn't get back to work on time, so he was moved from the more important section. Eventually, he became the keeper of maps. Or was it the other way around? In any case, he's also had this role as in the maps. I think he was originally working in the map section and got moved to numismatology because that's sort of didn't have to open on time every day back in the day. As I said, Blue of Noon, written in 1950, not published until 1957. Another book, well, not anonymous this time, but sort of a side perspective. It's very interesting because it starts in the Savoy Hotel in London, and then they travel around and travel to Spain. It has a commentary on bullfighting. And so in the 1920s, he had been involved with surrealism and then kicked out by, I think the second Manifesto of Surrealism by Breton in 1928 kicks him out. I'd have to check that. By which time Bataille started to be involved with a group called Contra-Attack, and had links with Trotsky, the renegade communist who was forced out of, had been a comrade of Lenin and Stalin and everything, had been a Menshevik and then a Bolshevik and then the commissar for the army during the time of the Kronstadt and stuff. And eventually was part of the opposition group in the Bolshevik Party and fled Russia and gave up on the Russian Revolution and tried to, at least in some sense, formulate a more global revolutionary movement, but also, don't know if you have positions on Trotsky, but those who follow Trotsky have reified some of what he said early into like a methodology and find it very dogmatic and hard to work with them, very hard to work with them. But anyway, Bataille was working with a friend, at least, of Trotsky called Souverain, who had fled to Paris as well, or was in Paris anyway. And they were writing in this journal Contre-Attaque and Critique Sociale. And by early 1930s, Bataille was writing often for this journal and started his own journal as well called Documents. And Documents just lasted 2 or 3 years, 15 issues or so. But it's amazing because it's the forerunner of cultural studies, not just anthropology is involved here. I mean, they had articles like, there was a 2-page article on the big toe. So they would take up issues that nobody had ever taken up before and think about them anthropological. What's important about the big toe? It helps you balance, helps you walk. Without a big toe, and there's a full-page picture of someone's toe, like hairs growing up, and gnarly toenail, and quite bizarre. But there are other essays in Documents on coins. As I said, he looked at bulls on coins, so he was interested in bullfighting. And many others who were surrealists or who had been kicked out of surrealism wrote in Documents. And Documents was one of the great experiments in publishing. Let's say there's a big thing. There were so many. In other courses, I talk about zine culture a lot. In a way, this period in the late 20s, early 30s, the flourishing of small journals and small publishers and DIY publishing was huge. I'll talk later about Nancy Cunard and the Hours Press. But there were many such small presses using old-fashioned hand printing and making short print runs of maybe only 200 books or something, and setting up these small journals like Documents, or running clubs for publication, like another one, the Collège de Sociologie, set up by Bataille and some others, ran a bit later in the 30s, and also published a few things. Small exercises in scholarship that didn't institute new universities or new departments, or they were kind of against the authority that comes with becoming an established thing. And that's what was wrong with surrealism, that Breton had kind of wanted to establish it as a bona fide movement or recognized style in art history, kind of give it more glory than maybe was healthy. Anyway, subsequently, surrealism has become exactly like that and can't be avoided in the history of modern art, right? In Contre-Attaque, by the 33, the rise of the fascists in Germany became an issue for leftists, for communists like Bataille and Souverain and Trotsky as well, and writing very early against fascism. Bataille had turned to Marx's economic work and was thinking about this idea of solar exchange, and wrote this essay on the uses of expenditure in 1933. Then in 1935, the psychological structure of fascism, which was related to the uses of expenditure. The energies that were involved in fascist thought. I mean, one of the very early warnings that the Nazis were, Nazis were warnings about the Nazis, the coming dominance, the fascism as a mode of not thinking, basically. So Bataille's output in this period is massive, and Bataille is like generating so many texts and groups, and his mind and his activity is very open and wide, and in a way, World War II, when it comes, the fascist war, turns him inside he writes a book called Inner Experience. He thinks more about eroticism. He writes about Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche, who at that period was considered the thinker of, I mean, he'd been dead 60 years, but was considered the thinker for fascism. The fascists adopted Nietzsche and the idea of the Uberman, the Superman, the great German, as their model, although there's no way that Nietzsche could be construed as fascist. It was, in a similar way to Wagner being adopted by the fascists. It doesn't quite fit and doesn't make sense, but they did pick up on Nietzsche. Whereas Bataille read the texts and produced a different Nietzsche to try and, in some part, save him from the fascists. And just after the war, he'd spent a lot of time he spent the war outside of Paris. Survived. I mean, he was traumatized by the First World War, right? And then by the second, he was a bit too old to fight, and he took a kind of refuge both outside of Paris and inside his study. And you see a turn of his work to creativity, the idea of creativity and what it is that we do, but it was no longer public directed, even though, yes, he did take up the editing of a very important newspaper, which he then edited for the rest of his life, and became one of the main newspapers, literary press work, and produced a series of books, and produced this 3 volumes of a work called The Accursed Share, Part Maudite, which is amazing. Actually, The Accursed Share I want to try and explain. So The Accursed Share is that we have so much energy, and the war was an example of this. We, whether it be society or we humans or an individual, has so much energy that we require some special activity and expenditure to get rid of this energy. Otherwise, it'll burn up inside us. It'll burn us. It'll consume us. So here, the quote: "The extension of economic growth itself requires the overturning of economic principles, the old economic principles of marginal calculation and so on. The overturning of the ethics that grounds them, right? One spends when one wants something or useful. Changing from the perspective of restrictive economy to those of general economy," which means his economy will consider everything, is a Copernican transformation. Copernicus, the guy who pointed out that the Earth revolves around the sun, not the sun around the Earth, right? A revolution in thinking, a reversal of thinking and of ethics. If a part of wealth rough estimate of all of society, must be doomed to destruction, which is his argument, or at least to unproductive use without possible profit. It's logical, even inescapable, to surrender commodities without return. He's thinking of anthropology, of the cooler, but he's also thinking of the war, right? The cooler, or at least gift giving in the Trobrians. If you amass wealth, you need to give it away without expectation of return. In fact, you get a sort of return that gives you prestige. Later, Derrida will use Bataille and show there is no gift without a counter gift, without a return, even if it's just a conceptual one. You give and then someone owes you a debt. But here, Bataille is thinking about the ultimate giver is the sun. The sun gives us energy without us giving the sun anything. So this is general economy. And in some sense, you need to see that if you don't give without return, you burn up. And the sun, if it didn't expend its energy, that energy would consume it in a supernova or something. Similarly, you can think about how a flower bursts forth in color and leaves and so on. I mean, sure, partly to attract the bee to come and pollinate, right? But much more than is needed to get that bee to come. This energy that just a plant has. And similarly, you can think of society. And in fact, this is how he was thinking of the war. At the same time, the dread mounts from day to day before the imminence of physical extermination, that humans could kill themselves in another terrible conflagration. He was remembering World War I. A stupid imperialism precisely engendered this fascism that we mean to fight while marching in ranks assigned to us by the generals and industrial magnates. So we're going to use our energy to line up in formation and defeat fascism, and a necessary expenditure of energy, and it generates, I suppose, the economy, the war economy, the arms economy, and so on, against the more restrictive views of the undoubted importance of exchange in social life. The emphasis on giving for the sake of giving, on giving as expenditure, this is Taussig now, was Bataille's contribution to social theory. Now, here's the thing that Bataille really says. An organism that generally receives more energy than is necessary to maintain life, so sun on a flower or humans working together, producing more for exchange than we need to produce, that excess can no longer be used for the growth of the system, and if the system can no longer grow, the excess can't be completely absorbed in its growth. It must necessarily be lost without profit and spent somehow gloriously. And he's thinking of the ceremonials of the Inca or some kind of extravagant, useless consumption, right? Or conspicuous consumption in Thorsten Veblen's sense, to consume that excess wealth in luxuries allows the economy to then keep going, gloriously expended or catastrophically expended in the excess energy wastage of war or nuclear weapons or something like that. This is Bataille's idea, right? That we have to give without expecting return, and our choice is give gloriously in ceremony or in art or decoratively or something, or destructively in war. Or now, there's so many different ways in which you would want to hold back on that idea, but of course, only some people can live luxurious, expend luxuriously because they've got it, they've accumulated, and have the privilege, right? So, and that comes to the idea of a big man in the Papua New Guinea, in the gift giving in Papua New Guinea, the prestige that comes to the one who gives away the most is really significant. The war, with World War II coming, Bataille, or just afterwards, Bataille had written, we can hope to avoid war. That's the war that's threatening, but to do so, we need to divert the surplus into a rational extension of industrial growth, which may be difficult, or into unproductive works that will dissipate the energy, which we can't accumulate in any case, or destruction in the war. Right, so Bataille really was thinking about fascism and this, but the art industry took him up as significant for thinking about creative arts, and they it's almost as if they couldn't handle his political side. But that'd be true for Breton in the manifestos of surrealism, or in some of the other parts of surrealism that were apolitical. Now, the surrealists did eventually late 20s join the Communist Party, and they were one of the first groups outside of the Communist Party. Well, they joined the Communist Party, but they started outside. They're one of the first groups to critique colonialism in Algeria, in Vietnam, and so on. They actually look at this cover of the Manifesto of Surrealism. One of the things they really were into was using different fonts, different layout, different styles of presentation to kind of try and break through to a different way of conceiving. So they wanted to critique colonialism or bourgeois life or the way things were by presenting us with visual triggers to see something different. So they wanted to see the surreal, the real, the super real under the appearance. And so Bataille then was a surrealist. He wanted to say, well, look at what we're doing. This war really, the reality of that is it's an economy. It's a war economy. It's the expenditure of this excess. So we could have spent it differently. We could have spent it in huge ceremonies of extravagant and glorious expenditure, but instead we went in for an orgy of killing and death in the war, right? His perspective on it. But the surrealists were doing similar things, but they were maybe, in Breton's concept, was a little bit more literary, or they played these language games, right? In order to try and get us to see through the ideology, the language that we used. Right? Anyway, this was Breton language games, and Georges Bataille was a part of that. He was certainly literary and fascinated with language, but he was the critic, as I said, critic from within, surrealist and an ex-surrealist, and a communist, and an anthropologist, and a friend of Michel Léry. I want to talk about him. They all came together in this group called the Acéphale, which is a club for sociology that thought of how to recognize or support a society that didn't get ruled by a very stale reason of the head or by the king or the authority, right? A society that was interested, sociology that was interested in the senses, was in the physical, was in the emotions and love and so on, wasn't so rational and wasn't so dominant in terms of hierarchy that it would have a king or an intellectual class ruling everything. I mean, it was against the monarchy, it was against the establishment, and it was against simple reason, recognizing that wasn't enough to understand humans. And that was like an art form, and many of the artists that Breton had brought into these language games supported that, and so on. As I said, there were so many publishing aspects to it, and playing with the layout of their manifestos, publishing manifestos or publishing journals or events that then became publications, was all the rage. And one that I wanted to talk about, and I've added her text to the e-learning, is Nancy Cunard. And she was one who, along with the Surrealists, so she was an American, American English, Cunard, from the Cunard family, like a well-to-do family, but she was disinherited. The shipping company, the shipping line. And Nancy Cunard here, you see she's got all these bracelets. That was another Surrealist thing. They were fascinated, well, also Picasso and people like that. They were fascinated with what they then saw as primitive art, right? African art. And here she's got bracelets from ivory bracelets from Africa, and they was they were her kind of trademark. Although she was what we now call an it girl, right? In the 1920s in Paris, and friends with all the artists and so on. Although she wasn't at all just the muse, like the artist muse. Sure, she was Louis Aragon's girlfriend for a while, and some others, but she was an artist in her own right, and especially a publisher. So she had this personality that you see, and was stunningly beautiful, of course, but she was also became a publisher and was very interested in creativity and the arts. She published the Hours Press, which generated a whole series of books in 29 to 1932 or so, and discovered people like Samuel Beckett, right? Beckett, Waiting for Godot, I think, although she published only a poem of his through a competition, but to have discovered Beckett is enough. But she also published many other famous artists, and she went on to produce an anthology called Negro, which was about the plight of African Americans. One of the first to draw attention to and put together first white people anyway, to put together a volume drawing attention to the condition. She got all sorts of people to write for this, Beckett and W.E.B. Du Bois, the famous black sociologist from America, and others, in a big fat volume, which is hard to get now, but fantastic. And she published, as I said, hand press, this old press, working with Aragon often, and another guy called Henry Calther, to produce a series of books. They were impressed. But she was also a muse. I mean, she was no question part of the Surrealist scene. I mean, she was sculpted by Brancusi, which is like something, right? Here, she was photographed by Man Ray, the American Surrealist photographer. The sculptures of hers are completely surreal, trying to get her real essence and so on. You see her, the Brancusi figure of her it's her, but it's her bangles and stuff. Here she is with Louis Aragon and Henry Calther, who introduced her to the stuff around Negro. He was working in the press for her, and you know, they really were dedicated to the production of texts that we would call now zines. And often it was poetry, and she wrote her own, published her own poetry and so on. But she also got involved in things like, she produced a series of books, small pamphlet books, I suppose, in 1935, 36 on the Spanish Civil War, poems against the war, which is really important. I mean, in part, they belong to the Surrealist project of trying to see the real behind the real, you know, to see in the commodity fetish of, or the fetish of contemporary society, the real economic drivers. They use different, besides publishing pamphlets and zines and small books and poems, they use different writing games to try and break through. I mean, so they were interested in Freud, for example, the surrealists. And automatic writing is one thing that helps us understand that. And it can be important for, if you think of Taussig and the writing of diary, or him copying his, him studying his notebooks and picking out his little sketch drawings as a way to trigger his analysis or generate analysis of social life. In a way, they were looking for new techniques to break through to see the real of society, not just the facade. All right. And this was like a psychoanalytical insight. They wanted to get to the unconscious. So they did this thing called automatic writing. I'll go back to that slide. And this was an exercise, and I don't know whether it will work online rather than in class, but I've done it in class and it works. Try and do this yourself now. Take 5 minutes and only write what is in your head without censoring it, right? So take a bit of paper now, or do it on screen or what have you, right? And for the next 5 minutes, well, when we say start, we will write just what we're thinking, or just write without trying to edit, without trying to impose control, without trying to impress anyone. I mean, the idea is that by doing automatic writing, just writing whatever, not having any plan, you would get more direct access to the unconscious, the Freudian concept, right? Our conscious mind edits and is very careful to think about presentation of self, right? To present in our writing, in our self-presentation and so on, but an unadorned and unmediated real self is what they were aiming to get to. A more honest, authentic way of finding out what is in your head. Now, of course, we still edit even when we're doing this exercise, but the idea is to try and give it up. All right, so let's see what you produce in spending 5 minutes now. Right, everyone, spend 5 minutes. I wonder if we can do it on the e-learning in any way. Let me see. I'll stop sharing. Now there's a thing where I can use a whiteboard and open a jam. Start a new whiteboard. Okay. Share with one person. Turn link sharing on. All right. No, that's not right. Open on a Jamboard. Search for Jamboard. All right, I'll have to explore this. I don't think we can do it. I can't make it happen without having explored it in advance. All right, not to worry. The other thing I wanted to see is maybe we can make it happen using the discussion. This is one thing also I wanted to tell. Before we go into this, could one of you go to announcements and see if you can reply to one of these announcements now, because I'm told that I have turned on the discussion. So can anyone reply? Do you see the chance to reply to this yet? Anyone? Still can't. I've been to get help, and why not? Look, if you see, we go to settings, right? Start this discussion. Start this discussion. That's not the thing. The settings. No. Your post was successfully edited. You have 30 minutes. Blah, 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 blah. Announcements. If I'm on announcements and I go to edit the settings or permissions, right? You go to permissions, you'll see all this, right? You can see all this, I assume, yeah. And you see where it says, who can add announcements? All right, I can add student. Add a question, add student. I thought I'd done this. Edit any posts, school, pin discussions, reply privately to posts. All right, okay, add student. Rate posts, view private reply to announcements, add student. Reply to posts, add student. Maybe I hadn't done this when I've done all the other classes. Not letting me do it. No, I'd already done it. No. Split discussion, start new discussion, reply to posts. All right, add the guest as well. Yeah, student, I'd already done it. See, it says there that student, these are the people that can reply to posts and reply to announcements. And then there's no way to save it, so it's saved. Go back to announcements. In any case, I should stop the recording because we don't need to record all this admin. And we'll try and work it out.